For centuries, the mechanics of the monetary system have remained hidden from the prying eyes of the populace. Yet, its impact both on a national and international level provides the foundation for international dominance and national control. Therefore, how is money created? Where does it come from? Who benefits from it? And what purpose does it serve? Globally, as the very foundations are being shaken by a crisis in clear sight, there's an urgent need for an open and honest dialogue respecting the future of the global monetary construct. Taken to religious levels and beyond, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith in existence, from how money is created, to the policies by which it is governed, and how it profoundly affects society. The American Revolution began as the American colonies who sought to separate themselves from England and its oppressive monarchy. Although there are many reasons for the revolution, what particularly stands out as the primary cause is that King George III of England outlawed the interest-free independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves. Unequivocally, this forced them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England, with interest of course, which immediately put the colonies into debt. As Benjamin Franklin later wrote, the refusal of King George to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the primary cause of the revolution. Evidently, in 1783 America won its independence from England. However, the battle against the central banking concept and the corruption associated with it had only just begun. So, what exactly is a central bank? A central bank does not simply supply the economy with money, it loans it to them with interest. By increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity at this point to figure out the swindle. For every dollar produced by the central bank, loaned at interest, means every single dollar produced is the dollar plus a certain percentage of debt attached to it based on that dollar. Since the central bank has the monopoly to produce the currency and lends each dollar out with an immediate debt attached to it, where does the money come from to reduce the debt? You guessed it. It can only come from the same source, the central bank. It is for this reason that the central bank must perpetually increase its money supply, to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which only results in new money being loaned out at interest creating additional debt. The result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public, to ever come out of the self-generating debt. Sir Josiah Stamp, 1880–1941, said, "If you want to remain slaves of the bankers and pay for the costs of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and control the nation's credit." Henry Ford once said, "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." I quote this because it captures the fact that the contents may be unsettling compared to the condensed content previously stated. From all the research along with my educational background, I have been exploring the financial world for years, hence I think it will most definitely give viewers a comprehensive understanding of how the monetary system works and its impact on society. So, who regulates all the money? It's a simple question. As stated earlier, we know that money is created out of nothing and the central banks make a great deal of money from nothing. Unfortunately, our lives are essentially dictated by the construct of money. It's the primary concern, and that is all people ever worry about or talk about. Thousands of people seek higher education, to learn and understand money, so that we can exchange time, for this thing called money. Therefore, it only stands to reason that you want to know where money comes from and who issues it. Hence, you're about to find out in greater detail as to who controls our money. Everyone knows something isn't quite right with our financial system, but they are unable to put their finger on it. Most people think it's the failure of government, others think that it's the failure of capitalism itself. Scottish banker William Patterson stated, "It was decided that a privately owned bank that could issue the money to the government out of thin air was to be the solution." This was the very first modern central banking system in the world. Central banking is more influential than laws, governments and politicians, but strangely not the focus of the general public. Fast forward into the early 20th century, and after two failed attempts, a group of bankers wanted to put a central bank in the United States of America. As discussed, December of 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich secretly boarded a train in New York with 6 others. These individuals did not want to be spotted by the mainstream media of that time to avoid questions. Their destination, Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. The meeting lasted 9 days, which resulted in the creation of the Federal Reserve Act. This information is documented and a matter of public record. In fact, some of the participants went on to write about the meetings in their personal biographies. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, February 9, 1935, in the Saturday Evening Post stated, "It was as secretive, indeed, as furtive, as any conspirator discovery. We knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted if it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill. That bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." The bankers told the American public that the purpose of the system was to stabilize the economy and to stop the grip of the Wall Street banks over America. The problem was the guys that wrote the bill were the very same people they said they'd stop. If they succeeded, it would give a small group of men the ability to create money from nothing and loan it to the American government with interest. So why was it done in secret? Because the American people didn't want a central bank. Back then, unlike today, people knew what central banks were and understood who they were. Wherever a central bank went, wealth inequality followed, irrational swings between economic booms and busts, but with each bust, the elite or upper class of society mysteriously became richer, while the masses got poorer. The Federal Reserve was originally drafted as the Aldrich Bill, but when it came into Congress, they recognized Senator Aldrich's name, and sensed that something was suspicious. Therefore, the bankers needed better cover. Using 2 millionaire companions, they brought the bill forward to soothe the suspicions of Congress and renamed it the Federal Reserve Act. Next in this textbook lesson of deceit, the bankers set out to fool the American public through deception. The bankers also deceived Congress by putting clauses in the bill that limited their power only to remove them once the bill was passed. A double bait and switch routine on the public and Congress, that's all it took. The acts passed on December 23, 1913, while most of Congress was at home over the holiday season, and that small group had implemented the monopoly over the issuing and creation of American money. Today the Federal Reserve is the most powerful entity in the United States, and they're not ashamed to admit it either. Former Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, had this to say to this question: what should be the proper relationship between the Chairman of the Federal Reserve and a President of the United States? Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. What the relationships are don't frankly matter. What does all of this have to do with me, you might be asking? I don't even live in the US. Well, the central banking model from the Bank of England and the United States has now been put in all countries, and even consolidated power in parts of Europe as the European Central Bank, or ECB. This unites separate countries under one economic policy. The only places in the world that does not have central banks are North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. In 2000, this list suspiciously included Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. Secondly, since the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. This means that all central banks hold US dollars in their reserves. In other words, all other currencies are backed by the US dollar. This directly connects all countries to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy in America. Post-World War II monetary system, called the Bretton Woods system, was created. All US dollars were backed by and exchangeable for gold. A byproduct of this was that currencies used to be very stable in relation to each other. For all countries, the exchange rates were fixed, and year after year you could predict what prices were going to be. As a result, you could start a business elsewhere, calculate profits, and business was much easier before floating exchange rates. Unfortunately, in 1971, due to a falling US dollar, international capital flows into gold and the funding of the Vietnam War, President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Temporarily? The dollar was now floating and backed by absolutely nothing. Consequently, it has been this way ever since. So let's think a little. If the US dollar is backed by nothing and the world reserves are backed by the US dollar intrinsically since 1971, doesn't this mean that all currencies are now backed by nothing tangible, Only trust in the American government? Correct. Money backed by nothing. This is known as fiat currency. Fiat in Latin means let it be done. In other words, the Federal Reserve says it is money, so it is. A consequence to having money backed by nothing is that whenever the Federal Reserve creates money, it dilutes the currency supply of all other nations because their reserves are backed by the US dollar. All countries' reserves are worth less each time money is created. In the past few years, the Federal Reserve has printed trillions of dollars, and countries like Russia and China have noticed this. As a reaction to the money printing, these countries have been selling US dollar reserves and buying gold over the same period. But wait a second. Some critical or clever thinkers may have asked themselves, if every currency on earth is backed by nothing, how am I able to pay for things? Well, the whole economic system today is running because it is backed by faith. Faith that you can exchange your unit of currency for goods or services. Part of that faith comes from the fact that not many people know where money comes from. Consider the following. Here's a quote from the Boston Federal Reserve. When we personally write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. Consequently, that means they create money from nothing, and charge interest on money that never existed, placing the whole world in debt to something that does not exist. Essentially, the Federal Reserve is writing a check and creating money from a bank account that has no money in it. The money the Federal Reserve creates can be used as legal tender to buy things and eventually makes its way into the economy. If we attempted to do this, we would go to jail for fraud, but they can do it because they invented the system. This is the same system used throughout the world today. Another integral part of this money creation happens on the commercial side of banking also. For every loan taken to purchase a house, car or any other item, banks create money out of thin air of which interest is paid. Graham Towers, former governor of the Central Bank of Canada, states, each and every time a bank makes a loan, new credit is created. New deposits. Brand new money. Paul Tucker, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Banks extend credit by simply increasing the borrowing customer's current account. Essentially, what they're referring to is that each time the bank issues a loan, the bank doesn't use other people's deposited money to lend out as a loan, it simply creates new money. In today's banking system, this means typing digits into a computer. The reality is, 97% of all money is digitally created and only 3% is in circulation as physical cash and coins. What's even more interesting is that commercial banks can lend out 9 times more money than that which is in the reserves. This is known as fractional reserve lending, authored by the Federal Reserve Act, drafted in 1913 by a handful of bankers. The consequences of this system are staggering. For the more loans given out, the more money is created, hence the rest of the money in circulation is worthless and its value reduces as the years pass. This erosion is known as inflation. Fundamentally, inflation is a hidden tax that we all pay for the fraudulent money printed by a handful of men. This is the reason why in 1950s, a house could be purchased for $5,000 and a car for $2,000. Obviously, prices on such items are unheard of today. Costs will continually increase, consequently, central banks and commercial banks are only creating one thing: debt. When a loan is given, it's written down as an asset on the bank ledger as a negative form, kind of like a negative value of money, or otherwise known as debt or liability. Under fractional reserve lending, debt is money. Mariner Eccles, former governor of the Federal Reserve, states, if there are no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. Instead of gold being the backbone of our economy, it is now debt. The system we're currently under is referred to as the debt-based monetary system. This system requires that debt always increases as it perpetually grows. Countries and people must become deeper in debt, otherwise money would not exist in the monetary system, because debt is money. If society stopped borrowing money, the debt doesn't increase, the money supply shrinks, and the system fails. It truly is bizarre, but we're all trapped in this system. The Federal Reserve and other central banks control money by adjusting its supply and how much it costs to borrow money, otherwise known as the interest rate. In 2000, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan reduced the interest rates to 1%. He did this to fight off the recession from the dot-com bubble and encourage people to borrow money. When interest rates are low, borrowing money saves on repaying mortgages. Since the 1% interest rate hadn't been seen at the time since the 1950s, it was a surprisingly good opportunity, and Greenspan's idea was that he could create a wealth effect. Greenspan's idea succeeded in getting people to borrow money to buy houses, but people began to borrow, which resulted in the 2008 housing bust. Hence, this is a prime example of what can go wrong when central banks manipulate an economy. It is for this reason that corrupt bankers have a lot to answer for in their role for the 2008 crisis. Fundamentally, the central banks and commercial banking control our economy. The distinction between the two banks is that central banks can create money at will, commercial banks need loans to create money. Consequently, central banks create booms and busts in the economy at will, including halts and disruption in the economy by manipulating the cash flow. As previously discussed, a central bank is essentially the entity that manages a nation's money supply, and it can loan money to the government with interest. In the United States and most other countries it works like this: when the government needs more money than they received from taxes, they ask the Treasury Department for money. The Treasury then receives an IOU or bond from the government. The Treasury, through the banks, gives this IOU to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then writes a check for this IOU and hands it to the banks. Upon making this exchange, money is created, and it can be used to pay government bills. Hang on. Where does the Federal Reserve get the money to be able to write this check? They get this money from nowhere. They literally just invent it. In 1881, then President of the United States, James Garfield states, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman states, "The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, stated that the prime reason for the American War of Independence was a battle over who actually controlled and issued the money of the new colonies. Some would argue that central banks are not inherently a bad thing. They just need to be part of the government and not privately owned. The government should be able to issue its own money for the benefit of the people and shouldn't have to pay a massive interest on its own debt. This was tried at least once in the United States by President Lincoln. He stated this: the government should create, issue and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity. Abraham Lincoln then issued his own government money, known as the greenback. There's so much that can be uncovered about what central banking decisions, and which revolutions were created around the world as a result of the central banking system. All revolutions and wars, when researched deep enough, boils down to money. Masses are starting to move their currency into gold, silver and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But there is one question that still lingers: is there light at the end of the tunnel? If this is your first time becoming privy to this information, I encourage you to do your own research, and then you'll start to see the bigger picture of the world economy and events will make more sense. Have you ever wondered why countries can't just print more money to offset their debts, or to feed the homeless or fix unemployment? This may seem like a silly question, but I think it may be one of those questions people might be a bit too complacent to examine, but there's a shortage of people investigating. The answer can be summed up with one word: inflation. Inflation is defined as a persistent, substantial rise in the general level of prices related to an increase in the volume of money and resulting in the loss of value of currency. This may not seem obvious, but it's something that's important to know. Money has no intrinsic value. What that means is that money has no actual value. It's only considered valuable because it can buy things, but if you were stranded on a desert island, money would be totally useless. Money only has value because we believe it to be so. This is known as the Tinkerbell effect. The Tinkerbell effect is used to describe something that only exists because we believe it exists, and in this case it's money. Hypothetically speaking, if people suddenly started to believe that money had no value, it wouldn't have any. Of course, it wasn't always this way. Money has been around for millennia, and when it was first used it was in the form of commodity money. Things were traded that had actual value and uses, like salt, spices, horses or weapons. As well as precious metals such as gold and silver, which technically don't have any intrinsic value either, but due to the rareness, it was used as universal currency. As mentioned earlier, almost every country in the world uses fiat money. Because fiat money requires faith and trust in the government, and that their money will have value. If we use a relatively young country as an example, such as the United States, it has gone through all three monetary systems within 200 years. First in 1792, when the US stopped using European money and the Coinage Act of 1792 brought the inception of the US dollar. The US dollar was originally in the form of commodity money, which was in the form of gold, silver and copper coins. The coins were made from real gold, silver and copper. However, although these coins were a representation of money, the value of the metal had an exactly equal face value. The country then moved on to a mixture of commodity and representative money with the 1900 Gold Standard Act. The government issued dollar bills which could be exchanged for gold at any time. Gold standard is a type of representative money that most countries used at the time. This was an effective way to accurately calculate the exchange rates between countries. For example, if 1 gram of gold cost £1 in Britain and $1.50 in America, then you can easily calculate that £1 equals $1.50. Gold coins were discontinued, and the silver was removed from the other coins, effectively ending commodity money, which was in 1971, when Richard Nixon officially abandoned the gold standard, and the US converted money into fiat money. As we now know, money isn't backed by gold or anything else of value. Fundamental economics tells us that an increase in supply results in a fall in demand and therefore a fall in price. Consequently, the more money in the economy, the lower the value of each dollar. The most recent example is Zimbabwe. In 2008, they suffered extreme inflation due to printing money. This was the result of some horrible decisions made by the President Robert Mugabe, because when the economy took a turn for the worse, Mugabe printed more money to pay government expenditure. This caused inflation to skyrocket, and, in mid-November 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation peaked. Inflation in the United States is around 2%, and economists generally agree that inflation level around 1 to 3% are optimum. First world countries' inflation rates today range from 0 to 5%. A country is said to have entered hyperinflation when their inflation levels exceed 50%. With that in mind, Zimbabwe's inflation, at its peak, reached 6.56 trillion %. It got so bad that prices doubled every 24 hours. The government tried to solve the problem by printing more money with higher denominations. They also kept knocking zeros off the end by revaluing the Zimbabwean dollar 3 times, going through 4 different types of currency with 4 different ISO codes. Before the final redenomination, they were printing $100 trillion bills. People were literally using wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. The government even made inflation illegal at one point, and people were being arrested for raising prices. In 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar was abandoned or demonetized, and to this day they still have no national currency. Their people use currencies such as the US dollar, the pound sterling, and the euro. Before the hyperinflation, the first Zimbabwean dollar was worth about $1.25 US. If that $100 trillion bill was worth that exchange rate, that single bill would be worth more money than there is on the entire planet. Twice over. But as ridiculous as this was, this is only considered to be the second worst inflation in history, after Hungary in 1946. Although Zimbabwe's inflation peaked in mid-November of 2008, their overall highest monthly inflation was 79.6 billion %, whereas Hungary's highest monthly inflation took place in July 1946 was 41.9 quadrillion %, with prices doubling every 15 hours. To put that into perspective, a country with a healthy inflation level of around 3%, prices double every 23 years. Their currency was called the pengo, and as inflation rose, the bill pengo, short for billion pengo, recorded the highest monthly inflation. Hungary also holds the record for the highest denomination banknote ever issued, the 100 quintillion note. In 1941, the exchange rate was about 5 pengo to $1 US. In 1946, when the currency was discontinued, things had gotten so out of hand that if you took every single banknote in the entire country, they would have a total value of 1/10 of a US penny. Printing money and injecting it into the money supply is known as quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is not as complicated as it sounds. It simply means printing money out of thin air, and then pumping this money into the economy. This is what causes inflation. Therefore, it is for this reason that the government cannot just print money to pay off their debts. It does not end well. Next, it's also important to understand exactly what national debt is. National debt is much more complicated than personal debt. It isn't simply a case of you owe people money. Take the country with the highest national debt, the United States, that currently has around $24 trillion of debt, and you're probably unaware that the country that holds most US debt is China. Essentially, the US Department Treasury issues treasury bonds. These bonds are a guarantee that the government will repay the debt with interest on that bond every year. Once the bonds have matured, they purchase the treasury bonds back from the holder of the bonds. If a country gets into financial trouble, it may have to default on its debt, which means the purchaser of the bond will not get their money back. However, bonds are generally considered to be an extremely risk-free investment because the US dollar is the most widely used and most trustworthy currency in the world. Notably, it's written in the Constitution that the United States cannot default on its debt. The reality what people call money is credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. In an economy with credit, the only way to increase spending is to expand borrowing. Which is exactly what the banks want. When people spend less, prices go down. This is known as deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced, borrowing and spending pick up, consequently it creates expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In a short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. This cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank and short-term debt cycles that typically lasts 5 to 8 years. Incomes may have been rising, asset values have been going up and the stock market is booming. But it's just an illusion, for the central banks create this fluctuation for their gain. Scrambling to fill the gap, borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks and banks get into trouble. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People feel poor, credit rapidly disappears, less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit and less borrowing. It's a vicious cycle. This appears like a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lowered to save the day. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate the borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and will soon hit 0%, so the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. But in all these situations, they were contrived by the central banks. Lenders realize that debts have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. Society feels crippled by the debt, hence they don't want more. Lenders stop lending. Borrowers stop borrowing. Essentially, the economy becomes not creditworthy, just like an individual. When borrowers stop taking on new debts, and start paying down old debts, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the opposite occurs, because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income, it causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden gets worse. A reduction in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher unemployment. Consequently, debts must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, but a borrower's debts are a lender's assets. When borrowers don't repay the bank, people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them. The panic begins. People rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed and people, businesses, and banks default on their debts. This severe economic contraction is a depression. A big part of a depression is people discovering much of what they thought was their wealth isn't there. All of this impacts the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. Therefore, many of the unemployed have inadequate savings and need financial support from the government. Governments are forced to create stimulus plans and increase their spending to make up for the decrease in the economy. Government budgets and deficits explode in a deleveraging, because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is happening today, evidenced by the coronavirus pandemic, which is upon us. This is what is happening when you hear about the budget deficit on the news. Unequivocally, we are headed for an economic reset. To fund their deficits, governments need to either raise taxes or borrow money, but with incomes falling and so many unemployed, where is the money going to come from? The masses. It is for this reason that Justin Trudeau raised the carbon tax by 50% April 6, 2020. Going back to the topic of depression, social disorder can break out. Not only do tensions rise within countries, they can rise between countries, especially debtor and creditor countries. This situation can lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 1930s, this led to Hitler coming to power, war in Europe, and depression in the United States. Pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Hence, most of what people thought was money, was credit. When credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People become desperate for money. Where is the money going to come from? The central bank. Having already lowered its interest rates to nearly zero, the central bank is forced to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary. Inevitably, the central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. This occurred in the United States during the Great Depression and again in 2008, when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets. The central bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money. So, in order to stimulate the economy, the two must cooperate. Woodrow Wilson wrote, "Our great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men, by very reason of their own limitations, destroy genuine economic freedom." Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, 1749–1832, said, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." In 2008, there was much to be said regarding the new North American currency, Amero, and how the Canadian dollar, US dollar and the Mexican peso were going to be demonetized, to bring in the Amero. The United States government allegedly shipped 800 billion Amero to the China Development Bank, in preparation for the collapse of the United States dollar. It was further stated that a force majeure, a force greater than can be controlled, would be declared, to be followed by the demonetizing of the dollar and peso, leaving society instantly destitute. Although the bail-in regime may not seem harmful, what is it really saying? With a massive panic breaking out in the financial system, the danger is exponentially growing. Taken from the Bill C-15, Chapter 7, Division 5, Bank Recapitalization Regime, bail-in. Conversion Section, 2.3. An order made under paragraph 39.131d gives the corporation the power to convert, or cause the federal member institution to convert, in whole or in part, by means of a transaction or series of transactions and in one or more steps, the institution's shares and liabilities that are prescribed by the regulations made under subsection 10, into common shares of that institution or of any of its affiliates. Simply put, a bail-in provides relief to a financial institution on the brink of failure by requiring the cancellation of debts owed to creditors and depositors. The cancellation of debts owed to creditors and depositors? Buried in the liberal federal budget that was introduced on March 22, 2016, under Chapter 8, Tax Fairness and a Strong Financial Sector, was a section titled Introducing a Bank Recapitalization Bail-in Regime. Simply stated, in the unlikely event of a large bank failure, the government proposed it would reinforce that bank shareholders and creditors are responsible for the bank's risks, not taxpayers. What that means is that shareholders, bondholders and depositors, rather than taxpayers, are responsible for the bank's risks in the event of a failure. On June 22, 2016, Bill C-15 became law along with its controversial bail-in regime. In the crash of 2008, governments bailed out banks with billions of dollars. The next time around, banks will be permitted to seize your deposits and exchange them for shares in a failed bank. Deposits under $100,000 appear to be covered by CDIC insurance, but anything above, personal or business, will be fair game for the bail-in. This bail-in does not only apply to Canada, but worldwide. The frightening question is it legal for the banks to take your money and not pay it back? The answer is yes. Because they convert your deposit, which is a liability, into bank liquidity in exchange for worthless shares in the failing bank. However, the bankers themselves secure their position, leaving you in ownership of a bankrupt bank. Bonds are going to get paid out in a fire sale/liquidation at pennies on the dollar, due to the financial collapse. The bail-in was nothing more than changing the rules in their favor. Consider, as a result of the contrived plan to sink the Lusitania as an excuse to enter the war, passenger tickets had a warning on them, advising travelers that they were boarding the ship at their own risk, because they would be traveling through German waters and could be torpedoed. As history shows, this is just what happened. Why are there not warning signs in front of every bank or financial institution stating the risks, and that you are relinquishing your rights to your money in the event of a bank failure, since they do not have enough money to cover deposits? Essentially, depositing your money at your own risk. Because if the general public knew this, it would cause the worst revolution known to mankind. Caveat emptor, Latin for, the principle that the buyer alone is responsible for checking the quality and suitability of goods before a purchase is made. What happened to a duty of care, which is the legal responsibility of a person or organization to avoid any behaviors or omissions that could reasonably be foreseen to cause harm to others. For example, a duty of care is owed by an accountant in correctly preparing a customer's tax returns. It's interesting to note, when you deposit money into the bank, you don't own it, but when they lend you money, they own it. This is nonsensical. Hence, banks bring a new meaning to the word asymmetry. Asymmetry exists when the two halves of something don't match or are unequal. If you understand symmetry, you're on your way to understanding asymmetry. When you see the word asymmetry, think unequal or unbalanced. Fundamentally, there exists massive asymmetry of information surrounding the bail-in regulation. Banks understand it, because they lobbied for it, giving bank executives the right to take risks with other people's money and not have any accountability for losses incurred. If the central bank can print endless amounts of money, why do banks need to seize ours in a crisis? Why are we paying taxes, if the money can just be printed into existence? The simple answer is hyperinflation and control over humanity. But people need to fully comprehend what this paradigm is, now that it is implemented, and take into consideration what alternative arrangements can be made. Such changes are so substantial that the Canadian and United States governments owed the public a duty of care, before proceeding with the implementation of this type of legislation. But they did not. Trudeau's new bill will allow banks to confiscate your hard-earned money. Yes, to confiscate your money, not because you owe it, but simply because the bank needs money. They can take it from you. This is Trudeau's idea of protecting Canadian taxpayers. This is a bail-in, it's opposite to the bailout. Conveniently, he changes the term government to taxpayers, and this is about protecting the government and their funds. It is an act of parliament that has been put forward that's part of the federal budget, presented on March the 22nd, and it became law on March 26, 2018. In 2008, when the American housing market crashed, the government, not just in America, but Canada and around the world, had to bail out banks. Interestingly, the governments gave these financial institutions money to bail them out, but, remember where the money came from in the first place: the banks. Governments worldwide gave billions, even trillions of dollars to banks. This time they're reversing the process. The reverse process is to allow banks to bail themselves in, by simply going into the accounts of their customers, and taking that money. On March 26, 2018, the Government of Canada released the final version of the bail-in regulations under the Bank Act, and the CDIC Act, bail-in regulations. The bail-in regulations came into force on September 23, 2018. But what is a bank's liability? In 2013, the banks held between $1.4 to $2 trillion in deposits, from checking accounts, savings accounts, and fixed-term deposits from the general public. All this money is a liability or a debt of the bank. If banks run into trouble, according to Bill C-15, They can simply convert deposited funds into common shares of their failing bank. However, many will believe that banks are secure institutions, therefore, a disaster would never occur. Nothing could be further from the truth, it's just smoke and mirrors. Moody's and Standard & Poor's, the international rating companies, rated Canadian banks as negative. Why? Because of the bail-in regime. Look at the housing market of Canada, which has skyrocketed in this country. Banks hold over $1 trillion worth of mortgages that's owed to them, from the housing market alone. All this money was created and owed to them, out of thin air. In May of 2016, the average price of a house in Toronto was $1.3 million, in Vancouver, it was $1.4 million. Interestingly, we've seen a 30% increase in 1 year, even though wages have not increased. Deutsche Bank put out a headline that read, "Canada's housing market is 63% overvalued." The Bank of Canada said, the housing market across the country is 30% overvalued, not just in Toronto and in Vancouver, but across the country. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, says that our housing industry is overheated, and at risk of a hard landing. Goldman Sachs, Citibank, the Bank of America, and JP Morgan, have warned their clients that there is a bubble in Canada, and it is about to burst. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, also a government entity, have announced that Canadian house prices are overvalued by 35%. So, what happens when house prices are overvalued? Banks give massive million-dollar-plus mortgages, then one day the housing market crashes. The result is that the banks are in distress. In Canada, debt-to-income ratio is one of the highest in history and compares dreadfully to that of the United States. Canadians are not just saturated in mortgage debt, but in personal debt. Canada's debt-to-disposable income ratio grew to a 163%, setting a record high in the country. What is astonishing about this is that in 2008, when the US was about to crash, the household debt-to-disposable income ratio was around 163%. Because of the levels of debt, the Canadian economy is putting the banks at risk, according to the Bank of International Settlements. This is frightening because in 2019, the Canadian debt-to-income ratio rose to 178%, which means that Canadians own approximately $1.78 for every dollar of disposable income. To determine the credit market debt-to-disposable income ratio, we add the credit market debt across all households and divide it by the sum of disposable income across all households. Credit market debt to disposable income equals credit market debt divided by disposable income multiplied by 100. Credit market debt, or CMD, refers to the current value of all existing mortgage loan liabilities, household lines of credit, and non-mortgage loan liabilities by all households. Disposable income, or DI, refers to the after-tax income earned by all households. Therefore, total credit market debt equals $1,530,000. Total disposable income equals $1,510,000. Credit market debt to disposable income ratio equals $1,530,000 divided by $1,510,000 multiplied by 100 equals 101.32%. Hence, the credit market debt to disposable income ratio measures the ability of households to manage their existing debt from their disposable income. The ratio can be interpreted as the dollar amount of credit market debt per dollar of household disposable income. In the example, households in the country would carry a credit market debt of $1.01 per dollar of disposable income. The Bank of Canada has repeatedly focused on household debt, which is a critical concern for the Canadian economy. Consequently, financial stress has become exponentially worse, and now with the economic crisis combined with the quantitative easing being injected into the economy is not helping matters. This is going to result in hyperinflation. This in turn is going to create more of a tax burden on the middle class, which always seems to be the targeted group. The number of Canadians that have become a few $100s away from financial insolvency has risen to approximately 50%. Hence, it is without a doubt that Canadians are immersed in debt, as many Canadians have been living off of their credit cards, further driving the debt ratio up. In 2016, the real estate market experienced a burst in property values, and for those who were buying a house for $650,000 when the true value was $422,500, may have had something to do with the financial collapse we are facing. The artificial valuation of the real estate market, together with those who were purchasing homes above the fabricated selling price, in a scramble to buy the property, is what is going to create a real estate crash. For years, Canadians have used housing as speculative instruments for business and as a form of stripping the market for equity profits, at the expense of others in need. Financial institutions use every maneuver available to them to entice people into debt, but when you can't repay the debt, they will leave you on the street. Contrary to the deception put out there by the financial sector, Canadian banks do not lose a penny when a homeowner defaults in mortgage payments, since all mortgages and loans are guaranteed by either the federal government, aka the taxpayer, or mortgage insurance. Bank mortgages are front-loaded loans, which means that they get their money first. In the last 15 years, most banks have gotten into the insurance racket, where they have bought up insurance companies. Therefore, money simply goes from one pocket to the other, and the public loses every time. Our fraudulent system is nothing more than a Ponzi scheme, for central banks continue to print money and issues checks for a currency that does not exist. An economic crash is imminent for Canada and the United States. The law has already been passed for banks and financial institutions to secure themselves through the Bill C-15, the Bail-in Act. We can't solve problems using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them, Albert Einstein. The entire economic system worldwide has gone from an ugly bubble to a black hole. The Federal Reserve announced they are going to print $2 trillion for the stimulus package. The problem here is that $1 quadrillion isn't enough to stop what we're headed for. Why should everyone else be concerned? Because the whole world's currency is chained to it. If the governments try to simply manufacture savings out of thin air, to get people deeper into debt by purchasing more products than they can afford, is going to destroy the currency. Taxation is going to implode, government expenditures are going to explode, the purchasing power of the fiat currency is going to go straight to hell, and the stock markets are going to shut down for a generation. As long as we have a lockdown and businesses are unable to operate, then it makes no difference how much money the federal government throws at the market. The governments and economists are aware of this, therefore why are they headed down this path? Keep in mind what happened to Zimbabwean dollar and the Hungarian pengo. This is eminently going to create hyperinflation or a deleveraging that will result in a depression. Extreme inflation forces people to spend as quickly as possible, rather than save or lend, so there is no money available to fund new businesses. All that uncertainty limits foreign investments and trade. The more money you print, the more inflation you get. Economists refer to $1 spent per year, a velocity of money. Therefore, when people spend their money as quickly as they get it, that increases velocity, which forces inflation up even faster. We are in a hyperinflation black hole. The $500 per week for a 16-week bribe to arrive in Canada is not enough to pay rent, mortgage, and even food. Oligarchs, small groups, are going to receive bailouts or bail-ins. Canada, the US and the world for that matter is plummeting into an ultra-recession, and the overlords have the ultimate weapon, the printing press for money. Hence, this diabolical machine will bring death to the world's currency and destroy the world economy. Prices are about to skyrocket, and it's just the beginning. Unfortunately, it's going to be a real mess. Asset bubbles have burst, real estate prices will fall, companies will fail, and this bogus service sector economy will be allowed to unwind, making it mandatory to declare the predicted force majeure of 2008. Many mortgage companies are going to collapse, as the government allows 12 months for delinquencies, as property taxes are connected to municipalities. Property taxes must be paid, which is also connected to property values. Mortgage companies may be ordered to stop recoveries, which stops the secondary market, which is tied to a byproducts and further debt issuances. Without investors, the housing market gets destroyed. Therefore, the entire system comes crashing down. To make matters worse, this will create chaos and manufactured wars. This is not the same as the 2008 crisis. We are talking about a total worldwide economic collapse. Sadly, this is an engineered collapse. What North Americans need to comprehend is that virus or no virus, the system is totally fraudulent, and it was inevitable that it would fail at some point. Due to a panic, fear and chaos, society is going to experience extreme violence, crime on a scale never before known, as a result of job loss and a lack of food. Society is going to become furious with the government. People will start dying due to a lack of medical care. As a result of most of society suffering from normalcy bias, mentally they won't be able to accept world conditions. However, people can only stick their head in the sand for so long. We need to understand that the economy was in a critical state before the engineered virus. The pandemic incident was the pin that popped the bubble. The biggest crash is yet to take place, and that is the bonds market. As it stands, we have gone from a market economy to a central bank-forced economy almost overnight. Looting on a small scale and you are classified as a criminal, steal from an entire country, as did Bill Gates, and you become a celebrity. An engineered collapse looks like this. The unemployment may rise to 25% or more by the end of June 2020. The reason I estimate unemployment at 25%, because that's what it was during the Great Depression. Conversely, this is going to be the biggest economic collapse ever known to mankind. The world is not in a recession, but rather at the beginning of a depression. Unfortunately, such a collapse is not felt instantaneously, because there are reserves. But as it stands, you have not seen anything yet. Canada is predicting that the social distancing, and reduced store hours, curbside shopping via pre-ordering will last until November, and now we are in a stage 2 lockdown once again. The way things are going, this economic collapse is going to make the 2008 crisis appear like a minuscule event. The best way to look at it is that our economy has blown a head gasket, and no longer able to repair it. Consequently, this means that our economy and society will never again be the same, nor will society ever know life as they once knew it to be. Businesses worldwide are bankrupting. This is threatening or even destroying our livelihood with fear-mongering, while the political parasites in the government get full pay. The public is being lied to on an unprecedented scale. The fact that major handouts have been given to corporations in recent years is concerning, which shows how fragile the economy is, coupled with how irresponsible corporations have been. Essentially, it is an indication as to how weak our economy really is. Sadly, governments are trying to fund a hole that is collapsing in on itself. The government intends on inflating all the debts away, then create a new digital currency, and forget what happened. Unfortunately, their solutions are the problem. During this coronavirus pandemic, if the government continues to keep spending money at these levels, there will be money in circulation, chasing after significant fewer goods and services. The result will be inflation, and a lot of it. North Americans need to comprehend and acknowledge that this is goodbye to our financial systems as we once knew it. Although it may seem preposterous to think that this is a contrived incident, the overlords are making an intentional effort to crash the financial system, to set in motion hyperinflation. After all, they are the ones who intentionally control the inflation cycles to begin with. But the real question is, how much pain is caused and to whom? If the system was reset by honorable men with good intentions, we would stand a chance, but what are the chances of those who are in control anything but honorable or wise, when we look back to their history and the underlying agendas? The true problem here is simultaneous demand and supply shocks, not sequential but parallel, due to authoritarian dictates forcing the shutdown via state of emergency being imposed, military deployments to enforce curfews or quarantine, loss of rights, speech, assembly, freedoms against search and seizures and arbitrary confinement. It is genuinely surprising that the government is forcing businesses to shut down. In Canada there are only 1,167,978 businesses, of which 407,175 are in Ontario, and 235,075 in the province of Quebec. This makes up 55% of the country's business sector. Small businesses are the backbone of the Canadian economy, and if the small business sector in Canada collapses, so does our economy. Ironically, the government has always been better at wrecking the business sector, rather than fix it. They are like an arsonist who sets the fire and then turns up to save the victim, but only after the damage has been done. This is truly communist and socialist theory at work. Helicopter money is defined as, this is an unconventional monetary policy tool aimed at bringing a flagging economy back on track. It involves printing large sums of money and distributing it to the public. American economist Milton Friedman coined this term. It basically denotes a helicopter dropping money from the sky. Friedman used the term to signify unexpectedly dumping money onto a struggling economy with the intention to shock it out of a deep slump. Under such a policy, a central bank directly increases the money supply and, via the government, Distribute the new cash to the population with the aim of boosting demand and inflation. If we consider all the lost income from the employment sector, the helicopter money, in most cases, it simply isn't enough to backfill the losses, and an aggregated demand will simply continue, even with the helicopter money, due to the lockdown that really does not need to be in place. If the lockdown continues, through the summer and fall of 2020, millions could stop making their mortgage payments. Hence, hyperinflation is going to happen as quickly as the stock market crashed in the first quarter of 2020, in a matter of days. Many mortgage companies are going to collapse, as the government allows 12 months for delinquencies, as this is connected to municipalities, but the taxes must be paid, which is also connected to property values. At the present time, the only area to spend money is mostly on groceries. $1,000 to $2,000 per family is nothing compared to the trillions that these thieves have stolen from our economy for their own gain. Here is a better idea: seize the central banks under the RICO Act for involvement in racketeering and funding terrorism, remove all fraudulent income taxes, and rehypothecate all the fraudulent tax receipts back to every single citizen who paid into this fraudulent system. Re-establish a currency which is backed by gold and silver, cut back corporate tax rates to give business an incentive to produce and stop spending money on unnecessary expenditures. The increase in gainful employment income would be phenomenal. The dollar has lost 97% of its value since 1913. The United States is approximately 200 years old. So, from day one to 1999, the United States accumulated a deficit amounting to $5.6 trillion. Yet, at the end of 2019, it had increased by $17 trillion. That accounts for 75% of the current deficit, in only 20 years. Although Canada's deficit is not in the trillions but in the billions, they are not far behind as the numbers are relative. In a short period of time, relatively speaking, the economy will be shattered. If the virus effects from doesn't kill you, the economy will, limiting your ability to work, what you can eat, and where you will travel to. The outlook is bleak at best, and it not due to the virus, but due to the contrived government actions for the Agenda 21. Lockdown means little or no new production, consuming what is stored as surplus in the distribution centers, while the government prints more money, causing us to bid together on the same scarce resources. Why is the price of gold not skyrocketing? Seriously. People ran to hoard toilet paper but not gold. Can't society see the coming hyperinflation? More money, fewer goods. Do the math. After the initial crash in 1929, the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to zero, output and prices fell, and society anticipated further price declines. Unemployment rose to 25%, and the average household income dropped to around 40%. Stagflation is when output slows down or stops or stagnates while prices rise. Stagnant economy divided by unemployment plus inflation equals stagflation. Central banks tried to address this by boosting the money supply and cutting the interest rates, but the output couldn't rise much because of the low productivity and oil shortage. The injection of the extra money only triggered inflation. Throughout history, in every case where it has occurred, there was an incident that disrupted the natural flow of goods that a country could produce. Until governments truly embrace the mission of improving society, we are doomed to suffer repeatedly a worsening crisis which will ultimately lead to conflagration. Conflagration is defined as an extensive fire which destroys a great deal of land or property. Although one may think that governments need to be held accountable, society has naively believed that voting for a new government will right the previous government's wrongs, but history has clearly shown us that this is not the case. Remember, the overlords control the governments. In 1913, the United States was sold out, and the rest of the world selling out to the Bretton Woods Agreement, at their most vulnerable time. Consequently, until the Federal Reserve and Bretton Woods are abolished, and private banking outlawed, absolutely nothing can be fixed, for the whole world is chained to it. The entire world is a playground for the elite, not a democracy or even a nation. Hence, we need to comprehend, acknowledge, and accept that the economy is going to crash. This is the contrived incident put in motion by the overlords, to begin ushering in the new world order. History is repeating itself, in other words, the elite are about to pull off the largest robbery of all time. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Albert Einstein. Society needs to accept the events that are taking place, for the time has come, as predicted thousands of years ago. Ezekiel 7:19 says, "They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be treated as a thing unclean. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. It will not satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs, for it has caused them to stumble into sin." Bailouts and bail-ins will not repair the economy, it will only cause more inflation. The only two ways to get out of the sovereign debt is default or hyperinflation. However, the overlords are not willing to default and would rather create a condition of hyperinflation, for this is the perfect way to usher in the Agenda 21, New World Order. The problem the human race is faced with is the consequences of a global meltdown which is going to cost many lives of all ages before this pandemic is over. The cure proposed is worse than the illness itself, for this is a manufactured occurrence. But the fearful question is, what happens when the central banks are not repaid, when social programs go insolvent? What happens when pension funds start to reduce outflows? If you have not yet seen the picture, this all adds up to ominous expectations or hell on earth. Once food shortages start to occur, the panic will begin to escalate and looting will spread. Hydro will be available as long as people are able to pay their electric bill. Once the hydro companies start putting people in the dark, and allow heat and cooling to be shut down, you will begin to see mass hysteria. Hydro companies are ruthless, and they have proved that in many situations, over the years. Even though many businesses have closed, including school facilities/buildings, hydro income has been greatly reduced, and it will be a matter of time before they will need another increase. Municipalities will discover loss of income due to low tax intake and the budgets will be totally screwed. If the pandemic is under control, people go back to work, then the utilities will increase, property tax will explode for most local cities, towns, and countries. Consider the following: imagine the utilities doubling, then property tax doubles, while on a fixed income. Throw in higher inflation and fuel costs, add the 50% in carbon tax recently increased April 6, 2020. This adds up to a crisis for some, chaos for others, and insolvency for many. Consequently, many families will be unable to weather this storm and keep a roof over their heads. Regretfully, the only source of sustainability we have is a fiat currency that is printed out of thin air, with nothing of value to back up the note. Isn't that just lovely? But if you think about it logically, how are they ever going to implement a one-world government without a global crisis that necessitates centralized authoritarian controls? Therefore, an incident to affect and influence public opinion is necessary. Welcome to the engineered plandemic that will create a global economic collapse to usher in the New World Order, Agenda 21. The only pandemic threatening the world is the stupidity pandemic. Here's why. The bankers are replicating the past, for since the 1920s they have stripped the public for hundreds of trillions of dollars, and while the public ended up in poverty, the central banks came around to buy up assets for pennies on the dollar. As the government continues to shovel billions and trillions of dollars into a pretentious fraud, we are squandering our chance at vitality. I once read, "Give a man a gun and he will rob a bank, give a man a bank and he will rob the entire world." As the government encourages a financial collapse with the disease catalyst, the primary purpose for the intended virus has been accomplished, which is known as operational control. Operational control by definition is the authority to perform those functions of command over subordinate forces involving organizing and employing commands and forces, assigning tasks, designating objectives, and giving authoritative direction necessary to accomplish the mission. As the governments execute standard protocol using operation control, the masses are sitting at home on the Chesterfield watching endless and mindless, mind-bending television. This is a war, for North Americans are not facing a COVID-19 pandemic, but rather a man-made plandemic to usher in the New World Order, and they are using it by keeping the masses confined under false pretenses. If you look at the realities of what is transpiring, you will quickly see that this is a means to place a chokehold on the masses while they covertly prepare their next move. The rights and freedoms as people once knew them to be are gone, and they are not coming back, for this is the whole purpose behind the Agenda 21. Capitalism and democracy are terms of the past, evidenced by having 1/3 plus of the population in survival mode, and as long as this protocol is in effect, the results will accelerate exponentially as the lockdown continues. The only thing keeping this Ponzi scheme afloat is by keeping the Ponzi scheme moving. It's now time for the architects of this scheme to take control, which was the main objective of urgency since 1954. The collapse of the entire system was inevitable. A new predetermined normalcy has been prepared for the human race, which will ultimately demand that you give up all your rights and freedoms, together with your sovereignty, to one man. But everyone needs to prepare for stepping out of the tyrannical system altogether, or surrender to what they believe to be a higher sovereignty. The best way to take control over a people and control them utterly is to take a little of their freedom at a time, to erode their rights by 1,000 tiny and almost imperceptible reductions. In this way, the people will not see those rights and freedoms being removed until past the point at which those changes can be reversed. Adolf Hitler. Ultimately it comes down to this: a deep state is controlling and maneuvering events, strenuously pushing towards a new world order. These secret societies have existed for decades to achieve total global control and domination, to enslave mankind. The President of the United States in the 1960s tried to bring an end to these secret societies. Unfortunately, this cost him his life, John F. Kennedy. However, he left us with a warning, which up until now has been ignored.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them.
Since the beginning of the pandemic in the first quarter of 2020, the Canadian economy has been hit hard. Hence you don't have to look very far to see how hard the country has been hit. Unfortunately, most Canadians have not realized the impact it has had on the country and what is to soon follow. The GDP is expected to reflect a 10% decline for the year. According to statistics, this will make Canada the hardest hit country in the world. This suggests that the economic activity will decrease by a shocking 7%, which has the Bank of Canada wondering what will transpire next. The first and the current lockdowns have slammed almost 90% of the business sectors, primarily the small business sector that employs lower-income Canadians. Hence, the longer the lockdown continues, the harder it will be to recover, for the unemployment has risen to approximately 14%. In the event that this continues, Canadians can expect to see a 40% reduction in revenues, which will result in higher unemployment. Due to high overhead costs, a staggering 40% of the restaurants have been forced to close permanently. This translates to approximately 800,000 to 1 million restaurant employees are jobless, without an alternative source for gainful employment. The business bankruptcy expectancy is 50% by the end of the year. Personal bankruptcies are expected to reach over 1 million. According to Global News, over 1 million employees lost their jobs in March alone, and even more were unsure if they would have a job by the end of the year. Globally, the entire world is in the midst of a historic economic crisis, suggesting a depression by the beginning of fall 2020. The Canadian debt-to-income ratio is at 178%, and Canadians are about to realize a decline in real estate value, as Canada's housing market is 35% overpriced. Oil and gas makes up about 10% of the GDP in Canada, but what is even more frightening is that 90% is on lockdown. Unsurprisingly, this creates a domino effect, because with 80% of the business sector shut down, energy sector will lose tens of thousands of jobs nationwide. Due to the severity of the impact Canada has faced for 2020, it will be several years before the country returns to semi-strong economic stability. But this does, however, depend on the employment sector regaining the momentum it once had. The pillar of the Canadian economy is the small business sector. If the small businesses cannot gain momentum early 2021, will drive the unemployment rate in excess of 25%, putting Canada in stagflation, which will result in a complete collapse in the economy. Prime Minister Trudeau has overextended Canada's ability to weather this crisis by spending money like a child in a candy store. This, however, does not include the multi-billion-dollar scandals, such as the We Charity, along with the casino bailout. Regardless of the filibusters he continues to create, he should be held accountable for his actions and unethical practices amid this economic crisis. At this juncture, it is uncertain how Canada will repay the debt for quantitative easing. In the event that Canadians are faced with a lockdown throughout 2021, most Canadians will be broke and bankrupt.
It is morning here, so there's no news to speak of yet. But there will be. It's clear as crystal that the root of all evil is exactly that, and those in whom it is blooming are the enemy of humanity. The bankers are the problem. The bankers manufacture recessions and depressions to exert a greater control over social and political structures. The bankers create and finance the wars on both sides of the conflicts. The bankers orchestrate famine, poverty, and want. The bankers control the policies that control the media and the education system that is operated to maintain ignorance in the public so that they can be shorn like sheep. The bankers launder the drug money and keep drugs illegal. The bankers are the problem. The international banker is the scum of the earth, and they have to be brought to account. What will accomplish this? There are several possibilities. One of them is a real run on Wall Street, where the public goes into their offices and dispenses frontier justice on their person. The other is some kind of cosmic intrusion of forces that I won't begin to speculate on, and the other is some kind of financial miracle in which they actually wind up broke. But I don't know how something like that would work. The most likely is a combination of the first two, where the second channels through the first. Once the cost of food, lodging and fuel hits a certain point, the public will be universally galvanized by the force that builds up from the pressure of their asses against the wall. We can be there in a few days. Once the system begins to collapse, it will have its own speed of free fall, and things will move at a spectacular rate of change. It will be like the way weather can suddenly transform in the South Seas. At the point when this begins to occur, the probability of global conflict will accelerate to maximum thrust. This is the primary truth about imperial currency activity. When the money goes south, violent attention goes east. Yes, maybe it will all just limp along on crutches while plastered with band-aids, but that goes contrary to the mathematics. You can spread the numbers only so thinly, or you can only press them together so much, and you're going to get holes appearing in the net all over the place, or you're going to get implosion. Do I have any idea what I'm talking about? It is possible that I do not. There's an area where allegorical poetry gains a mystical influx of metaphysical certainty that is no different from the theoretical physics, where theory is just another word for things we don't want to accept as inevitable. Maybe freedom's just another word for no one left to screw. It stands to reason that sooner or later the public will have no further option but to declare open season on the bankers. They'll be hunted down as the be-all and end-all of everything dangerous and wrong. They are a plague and a pestilence as bad as any epidemic. They are the whiskey and yellow fever blankets on the reservations of ordinary life. They are anthrax masquerading as sweet and low. They are the long-standing source of the majority of humanity's problems and have little competition except for the ubiquitous presence of ignorance and impossible dreams. Whoever these bankers are, that is who they are. When the shit hits the fan, as it is going to do at any moment, the guilt of the banksters is going to stand out like zits on a beauty queen. The transformation in the mind of the public is going to be immediate. People watch the news, and although it is nothing more than garbage and lies, the players have all been seen there. They've been seen in Congress, and they've been seen wherever the lies created to defend them have been publicized. They are a known quantity. There is no argument of any kind that can be used to generate sympathy for the bankers, who are either behind or finance every outrage against the public that is in existence. Now, their day is at hand, and they show no signs of having any kind of clue. They sit at their vanities and admire their image like Marie Antoinette. They whoop it up like Louis XVI in Versailles, surrounded by gold leaf wallpaper and sycophants, while they diddle the sons and daughters of a dying empire that they brought to pass. There is mercy to be found here, but none of it can be for the banksters who have acted with none in their intentional efforts to beggar, mutilate, maim and destroy anyone and everyone who is not them. That mercy is for the public who, like Lefty, only did what he had to do. I try to get my heart and head around it. I try to see an out for everyone, but the only out I can see for the banksters is out of our lives. and marched still living through the gates of hell, where they can reunite with the banker-in-chief. I'm not the judge or executioner. I'm an observer who's never had enough money to even think about the banks in the first place. Now the bankers tightly grasp what is going to turn into flaming coals in their hands. Judgment is going to cry out from the earth they walk upon and have plundered at will. That will is now going to be drained away into fear and apprehension. Their fortress walls are going to fall away. Their protectors are going to turn on them. Their holdings are going to dissolve and spill from their fingers like a handful of sand. I wouldn't want to be a bankster today, or on any other day. The existence of a system has kept them safe. This corrupt system has allowed for some kind of life for those preyed upon until now. Now it has turned upon those whose compliance has been forthcoming for so long. Soon that compliance will be gone, and there are not enough police and armies to quell what is going to rise out of the midst. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but like everything else, we'll see.
If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, and be sure to share.